The coming panel is on energy security. Let me do a brief introduction of a moderator, somebody who is an important pillar at Stanford Energy. He is a professor in the Earth School, now going into the Dodd School of Sustainability. He used to be the dean of the Earth School. He was the person 20 years ago really architecting and establishing Stanford Energy, starting from our global climate energy project to Precourt Institute for Energy. And he also served as the Undersecretary of Energy for Science. Now let us welcome Professor Lynn to the stage.
We have an absolutely fantastically qualified panel for this, and there's some parallels here. So they both are longtime Stanford faculty members in political science. Both have served multiple times in government at very responsible positions in national and international levels. Both are now here at Stanford serving in leadership positions. And Condi is the director of the Hoover Institution. And I have to say, she was my former boss when I was Dean of Earth Sciences, and she was the provost. And she was a good boss, I will tell you.
Better add that,
yeah,
yes.
I didn't solicit that.
Well, you know what? If she didn't agree with what I said, she said. But we always found ways to go forward together, and we actually had a good time. So at least I did.
We did.
So, and then Mike McFaul is the director of the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. And I know you know that Condi was National Security Advisor and Secretary of State, and Mike was the U.S. Ambassador to Russia, among other responsible positions. So they have a picture of the world that is as informed, I think, as anyone, particularly now that we have the Ukraine-Russia war with all of its impacts on energy markets, both not just in Europe, but around the world, on supply chains and all the markets that are affected with them, on the tensions amongst nations that are balancing combinations of interests. And so our task over the next little while is to try to explore what all that means for going forward, especially in a world where we want to try to work on reducing greenhouse gas emissions and work on climate change absolutely as hard as we can. So it's a complicated topic, but it's a good group to help us think about it. So maybe I could ask each of you but perhaps we should start by defining what we mean by energy security. I have a definition, but I'd actually like to hear you two. Condi, why don't you start, and then Mike, you can correct any lies and distortions in what she says.
Yes, absolutely.
And then I'll offer an opinion. Condi, go ahead.
Which you will, because I'm proud to say that Mike was also my student, so things...
Well, she was like 13 years old, by the way.
So when one thinks about energy security, I think that traditionally we have thought, do you have adequate and reliable sources of energy for essentially economic growth and economic activity? That's the way that we've thought about it in the past. And that is still essential. We'll talk about it later, but it's not just for economic growth and industrial activity, but it's to heat the homes of your citizens, something that we are worrying about, for instance, in Europe. Yep. And is it secure from any kind of malfeasance? We've worried, for instance, about security from cyber attacks. If you're Ukrainian, you're worrying about deliberate attacks on the energy complex. And so, do you have secure and reliable sources of energy? I think the piece that we've added over recent years, and I consider to be very important, is do you have secure and reliable sources of energy? Yeah, that, I was thinking that was a little strange, but I wasn't going to say anything. We're okay now.
No, these moderators, they've been sitting there. So,
but do you have reliable and secure sources of energy to do all of those things and to protect the climate, can protect the environment? And so I think that now, when I was secretary, I used to like to talk to countries about what I call the 3 E's, which is economic growth. And frankly, no country is going to give up on economic growth because that's, if you're in a democracy, that's how you stay in power. And if you're an authoritarian, that's how you keep from having revolts. Secondly, so the economic growth, energy mix. So energy security having also in it the context of, do you have a mix of energy supply that gives you reliability? And third, environmental sustainability. And those 3 E's somehow have to go together for every country. And so I now think of energy security as somewhat broader than just, do I have reliable supply to do the things that I need to do for my economy and for my citizens. I think of it also as, can I also, in a secure way, protect the environment?
And would you add affordability to that, given the instability that can arise when you have price spikes?
Absolutely. I think of that in the reliability category, but absolutely affordability is an issue. One thing that I experienced when I was secretary was oil went to $147 a barrel.
Yeah, right.
Now, nothing warps a diplomacy like oil at $147 a barrel. And secondly, nothing warps food security.
Right.
And we tend not to always make that link, but there were food riots at that point in the Middle East and Egypt and other places that were dependent because the transportation costs for food got to be so high that those countries weren't able to. So affordability is clearly a part of it. I think of it in the kind of reliability and can you provide for your citizens what is needed.
Makes sense. Mike, do you want to add to that? Do you want to put it in the context of what's going on in Ukraine, for example?
Okay, I'll try. Just a couple of comments. I mean, first, a couple of big comments. One, I am not an expert on energy or energy security. I'm a student of these topics. I served on the advisory council for the sustainability school with Arun and a lot of other people, and what I learned over that, it felt like many years, Arun, but it was like a year and a half, right? But Zoom calls from 5 to 7 Tuesdays and Thursdays. I think that was the rhythm of that. And what I learned from that is just how much I don't know, and I'm a huge fan. I'm a huge student. By the way, my son is too, a sophomore here. He's in that swim, and all we do is talk about energy these days, but I'm not an expert. Second, I don't think anybody in this room will disagree with me. Condoleezza Rice never needs a panelist. We can just interview her, and I actually have some questions for Condi myself, and we can just go back.
That's okay.
Right. So with those 2 caveats in mind, let me just say a couple of things. One, just remember the basics of what Condi said. I was just on a conference call this morning with colleagues of mine in Kiev, and they were all working with backup generators, right? Literally, they're members of the government, academics. It's a group I run on sanctions, and it feels really tangible to them when they literally do not have energy for their internet connections. One of the speakers did not have a stable line on the Zoom call because the energy generator that she was using was not working, okay? So that's the first thing, just to underscore that really raw part. The other part I would add is about the way I think about it, and remember, because of the things I worked on, and both at the White House and then in Moscow, is about energy interdependence versus energy coercion, right? And I was on the transition team from the Bush administration to the Obama administration, and I wrote the paper about how we should rethink Russia and Central Asia. And point 3 of that paper, by the way, drafted with your colleagues, because all of Condi's colleagues are still with us, guys like Dan Fried and people that work for us. So we were all together. But number 3 on that was to reduce energy dependence of our NATO allies on Russia, because we thought that would be good for American national security, good for the alliance. And I want to be completely honest, we failed at that completely. We did not achieve anything. We had talking points, they came up, but if you look in practical terms, we failed at that. They're now succeeding at it. We'll get to it, whether they will, but that's a great example of something that had we done that in 2008, we might not be in such a bad place today, especially going into this winter. And so, there is this line, interdependence. If we're all tied together, there's a long academic literature on this, that stops countries from doing stupid things. That's what President Obama used to say. And back then, he used to compare and contrast. We had a lot going on with China, and they didn't do as many stupid things. Putin, as Secretary Rice will remember, because she was secretary then, did a really stupid thing in 2008 in invading Georgia. And our analysis of that was, well, he didn't have much to lose, right? But in retrospect, I'm not so sure that interdependence works as well as we would like to, thinking about China, and most certainly thinking about Russia, that he made the calculation that he wanted Novorossiya more than he cared about his energy markets in Europe. And so I think thinking through how we reduce coercive capacity is also a part of energy security.
Yeah, actually, I think that's a question I wanted to ask in terms of how energy markets function, because there's always been kind of this assumption that whoever was the supplier would actually want the market and would want to sell to it, and that therefore being viewed as an unreliable supplier was a big disadvantage. Now, you two are better in a position to judge what Mr. Putin has, the calculation that he's done in all of this, but he's certainly made the point that they're not a reliable supplier. And that must be inducing a lot of angst in, well, we know it is in Europe. Can you, from your various points of view, can you kind of talk about the situation in Europe? It's certain to be tough this winter. The gas supplies are much reduced, and even with LNG imports, there's still going to be a big restriction. So there's going to be potential for considerable difficulty in Europe and then beyond. So you two, kind of from your various lenses, could you comment on that? Maybe Condi, why don't you start?
Right. Well, I would like to separate Europe and Germany, because I think we sometimes speak of Europe when, and Mike is right, that we argued with the Europeans, actually going all the way back to Ronald Reagan, don't become dependent on Russian natural gas. Don't become dependent on Russian natural gas. At the end of the term of Gerhard Schröder, he not only laid the groundwork for the shutting down of German nuclear power. The French get some 80% of their generating power from nuclear. But he joined the board of Gazprom, which a lot of people thought was a rather odd thing for a former chancellor of Germany to do. And so the reason that I focus on Germany is that actually after Crimea, some European countries, particularly those in Eastern Europe, did start to relieve their dependence on the Russians, so that the Poles are, when the Russians said they were going to cut off supply to Poland, they said, that's fine, we're 15% dependent, we can substitute. So some countries did take the idea and began to substitute for Russian energy supply. But the reason that I focus on Germany is that, first of all, it's a huge economy, and it is causing reverberations throughout the European Union politically, that it has become a kind of Germany first idea. So they are going to subvent on behalf of their citizens with subsidies so that their citizens don't have to go dark and cold in the winter. And much of Europe is saying, well, but what about the European Union and us? So I make the point that it's put strains on the kind of unity between the Europeans and the Germans. There are apparently plans to be able to go to alternate days for production and all kinds of things, but they're all hoping that they don't have to get there. And many people think that Vladimir Putin, whose first idea about Ukraine was that he would destroy the Ukrainian government, destroy an independent Ukraine, it was going to take 5 days because they took 5 days provisions and their dress uniforms for the parade, that once that failed, his new strategy is throw bodies at it, stop the Ukrainian advance, wait for winter, and winter has two effects. It stops the Ukrainian advance, and maybe Europe starts to freeze, and now you start to lose some of the unity that has been produced over the recent years. I think he's wrong about that calculation, but I think that's his calculation. I, Vladimir Putin, can outweigh you because you are still dependent on us. And so, I mean, Mike should comment, but then we need to look at, then what does that say about the next several years? Even if the supplies this year are enough, there is significant storage in Europe. What does it say about the next 3, 4, 5 years? The fact is that Russia, we're experimenting with something quite dramatic. We're pulling the 11th largest economy out of the international economy. We're pulling it out. It's sanctioned, it's isolated. Most Western capital and Western companies, I see Darren Woods down there, people have left. What does that say about Russia's energy production down the road and the change of the structure of markets that that's going to require?
So Mike, maybe you could chime in here. You've been in touch with folks in Ukraine, and so you can kind of bring us up to date on how they're feeling about it, even as we move on to the question that Condi raised about the rest of Europe and really beyond too, because the oil markets have been affected around the world as well. But let's focus on Ukraine for the moment.
Well, let me start with Putin and then Ukraine, because I think I really want to underscore this point, and when we talk about other countries, which I'm not as expert on, I'm really interested in what Condi has to say about it, which is, remember, back in more cooperative times with the Russians, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, we wanted to integrate them into the global economy. We thought that was good for us, good for them. Transfer of technology, good for them, good for us. Bring them in the WTO. I was part of those negotiations. The ExxonMobil Rosneft deal, I was there for that, sir. I was there. We celebrated. I sat on the stages thinking this is great because this is integration. And by the way, we thought this would pull people in Russia. I'm thinking of Igor Sechin in particular, somebody I have known since 1991. So we go way back. We're not exactly Facebook friends anymore, but he's the head of Rosneft. And it was having that effect. I think it's important to remember that I remember when Igor was getting ready for his first trip to Texas, and he'd never been to the outside world. It was our theory that integration would lead to rational behavior on part of their leadership. And it did for a while. I think that's important to remember. But it's also important to remember that at the end of the day, Putin made those calculations and he said, you know what? He's way more ideologically motivated, ideas motivated than just cost-benefit analysis. By the way, we get wrong the influence of the oligarchs on him when your property rights are handed to you by Vladimir Putin. Igor Sechin has worked for Vladimir Putin for 30 years. Igor Sechin's the CEO of Rosneft because he's Putin's friend, and for no other reason. We overestimate the influence that the more rational, technocratic actors can have. And I just think that's a really important story when we think about other countries as well in this space. With respect to the Ukrainians, they're nervous about something that a very senior Russian official, I don't think I'll name him because he wouldn't want me to, 2 days after I left Moscow, he said they were getting ready to go into Ukraine. right? We had some notion that they were. This is 2014, going to take Crimea, supporting the separatists in Donbass. And this was one of these economic technocrat types. He was a very senior guy, close to Putin, was a guy I did a lot of business with, behind closed doors. If I mention his name right now, it'll get him in a lot of trouble because I'm kind of radioactive in Russia. But we had this 4-hour conversation, this very philosophical thing about modernization and Putin as a transition figure and the younger generation at a very fancy hotel restaurant that he paid for, by the way. Corruption in this space is big. But he said, Mike, there's 2 things you need to know about us versus you and Ukraine. 1, you have a short attention span. Mm-hmm. And 2, we care more about Ukraine than you do. Mm-hmm. And those 2 observations from this guy 8 years ago is exactly what worries President Zelensky. That we have a short attention span and we don't like to suffer too much, right? I just told you about people living without electricity today, but then they see us complaining about energy prices and they're worried that we're gonna have a short attention span and that at the end of the day, echoing what Condi said, Putin's gonna play the long game and he doesn't care how much it costs, literally in terms of treasure or the best and the brightest, the young people of Russia. He does not care. He's not motivated by those things, and they think that eventually they'll stick it out, and that's what the Ukrainians worry most of all about. Mm-hmm. And they're watching our elections, by the way, and they're watching protests in the Czech Republic, and they're watching what's happening in Italy. They're by the way, what's happening in Italy is pretty good for them. They worry. They thought it was going to be a lot worse, but there is this. Putin, in addition to waiting it out, he also, he just spoke at this thing he does every year a couple days ago called Valdai. He goes for 4 hours answering questions. Kind of remarkable that he does that, by the way. I give him credit for that. But he's also playing a long-term game in Europe and to a lesser extent in our country about dividing us internally, right? And he said that very explicitly. He said, I got no problem with Americans and Hungarians and Italians and French, this kind of division within countries. My problem is with the elites in these places. And he's waiting to play that out so that this changes. So that's what worries the Ukrainians most of all.
So what does that all imply for how energy markets work around the world? We in some sense, we've already reorganized the market for natural gas because there's this push to try to get some gas to Europe. But that gas came from somewhere else, and the time scales for changing that supply picture are long. It's also modified the oil markets because there's less Russian oil being sold in the places it was being sold before, but more in China and India. Are those things that persist at some point after this conflict, or does it go back to the way it was before?
Well, I think that this is a question, and I'll put it this way. Very often when we ask a question, will this happen? The policy question is, how do we prevent this from happening?
Well, yes.
Yeah.
And
I'm holding that one for the next.
Yes. But we do have a dramatic interruption of the normal energy markets, and we're seeing that. And I suspect in terms of the Russian energy market, it's going to be a long-term disruption because with the decision to leave by particularly the Western majors, also went a lot of the technology that was helping to develop, very difficult to develop oil fields up in Siberia and the like, and the Russians are not going to be able to replace that technology. They'll puddle around for a while, but they're not going to be able to, they don't, I'm told, have the people who are trained to do that, and there is no substitute. So the Chinese are not going to be a substitute in that way. So I think it will change the long-term prospects for Russia as an energy supplier, and we need to keep that in mind. And by the way, yes, the Indians are buying their oil and the Chinese are buying their oil, but they're buying discounted oil. And I'm not sure that the Russians had counted on just how much of a discount they're having. And they're also having trouble, even in the near term, in terms of insurance for shipments and so forth. So I think the Russians are an even less reliable supplier, even if Putin wanted to be a reliable supplier. So that then comes to the question of, what are we going to do for the supply of oil and gas? And this puts on the table the question of what we do with the North American platform and what we do with the United States, Canada, and Mexico in terms of production here on the North American platform. It is really important that we try to do two things simultaneously. One is keep in mind the transition that we want to make to a less carbon-intensive economy, and keep in mind that hydrocarbons are going to be a part of that transition for a long time to come. And so you then have the question of where do you want those hydrocarbons to come from? If they're going to be a part of the transition, and they are, some talk about trying to make sure that it's more gas than oil and certainly coal. So that's one answer. But the other answer is you only have so many options. There's the Middle East, and Saudi Arabia. There's, to a very small extent, Venezuela. There is Iran. You know, the geology just isn't everywhere. I would love it if the geology were favorable in places that we like Germany. But the geology just isn't there. So if hydrocarbons are going to be a part of that transition, where are they going to come from? And I think that really does raise questions about what the United States needs to do in terms of its own energy policy. And it gets raised in terms of questions of our independence. And I don't like that language because as the major, largest economy in the world and the country that's always seen itself as the protector of the idea that the international economy does not have to be zero-sum game as it was before World War II, I think when we just talk about, well, we can take care of our energy needs, that's not a good message. But when we think about the world's dependence on hydrocarbons for some time to come, what role the United States plays in that in terms of production, I think is a very, very important question. And I don't think we're asking the question in a way that is by any means sharp enough, answerable enough, and that doesn't try to resolve contradictions that are probably irresolvable.
Can I just add a couple things on the Russia piece? Because I do think we're at this moment. And you know, I think we need to separate out gas and oil when talking about Russia. But and I just want to be careful. I don't know how this is going to play out. But both with respect to gas over this year and with respect to the price cap, the oil price cap, the G7, they like to use now price mechanism, right? Because they know it's not going to be a cap. So that's the new talking points, just so you know. But these are pretty big things that they're attempting, right? To reduce whatever they can over the long term supplies of Russian oil to Europe, and compel the Russians to find different markets with Chinese, talk about the Chinese who are playing very hard with prices. That's a good thing for me. They're ripping off the Band-Aid and they're doing what I think they should have done a long time ago. What we all should have done. We should have been, part of this. And I don't know how it's going to play out, but I'm interested in watching it. I don't know. I don't think it's going to go back to status quo ante. That's what you asked?
So you're saying that you don't actually know what oil prices are going to do?
I was talking about gas.
Oh, well, so
All right, but let's get to oil. Let's get to oil.
When people ask me that question, I say, well, the price is going to go up and then go down, but not necessarily in that order. And then I try to leave the room. But
there's a lot of expertise about those kind of things in this room that I'm not going to comment on. I do want to get to the oil just conceptually. Whether it works or not, how it works, but this is a very innovative idea, which is to say they can't cut off oil. They don't want to cut off oil for the reason I don't want to cut off oil from Russia. That's bad for the global economy. But they want to reduce the profits that Mr. Putin takes in that fuels the war machine that kills Ukrainians. That's a really good idea as far as I'm concerned. And, they talk about numbers 60, 65. Again, this room knows what those numbers are better than I do. I'm worried that the coalition that will play by this is going to be smaller than what they had hoped. it's coming, right? It starts in December and then really kicks in January. And I think they've done, the G7 here I'm talking about, I think they've done a lot of smart things with the tankers, with the insurance companies, with the financiers to try to say, play in our system and you're fine, and don't, and there are going to be penalties. And what I'm hoping, but this is the part I don't know, and Condi, I'm curious what you think. Right now, all the other entities are saying we're not going along with you, right? Formally, they're saying we're not going to go along. But if this kicks in, and the G7 saying you shouldn't pay, let's just say 65. By the way, the Ukrainians want it at 20. Just so you know, that's their target price. Surprise, surprise. But let's say it kicks in, and formally the Indians and the Chinese say, well, of course we're not going to play by this system. But will it put pressure? Will it help them in their negotiations to get even bigger discounts? And I don't know the answer to that. I'm curious what both of you think. Because this is different, right? We're finally saying we're not just going to let the suppliers coordinate. We, the buyers, are going to try to coordinate too. That's something relatively new, and I'm interested about it.
I do think, at least in theory, it's a great idea. I've worried about a couple of things with it. One is it's not just the buyers, I think, that might balk, but the other suppliers might balk.
Good point.
If you look at what just happened at OPEC, for instance, which was not as dramatic as what was reported. I'm a veteran of, and helped to bear the scars of, trying to convince the Saudis to do various things with price. Right? Every American president has this idea. I'm going to go talk to the Saudis and get them to fill in the blank, reduce production, raise production, and every American president comes back with nothing because the Saudis basically have a number in their heads, and that's what they play to. I recently heard a high-ranking Saudi talk about the fact that they see a slowing of the global economy.
Right.
They see that China's not coming back as quickly. And they therefore are playing their production numbers to what the global economy will look like in a year or two. So for all of those who said, well, it's because the Biden administration has terrible relations with the Saudis, no. We had really great relations with the Saudis, and they wouldn't do it for George W. Bush either. So I think the piece of this that I suggest might not work with the price cap is now if you are not the Russians, and you start looking at distortions, which is what they will call it, of the markets by trying to cap Russian oil, which of course oil is a commodity. Mm-hmm. So what does that do to other suppliers? Theoretically, it could mean that other suppliers receive more, theoretically, but I'm not sure that they're going to be willing to take that chance. Right. So I think it's not just a problem.
It could actually undercut them.
It could actually undercut them. So I think it's not just a problem for getting buyers to go along. I think it may be a problem for getting suppliers to go along as well.
Yeah, it's typically big leverage in oil prices come when the markets are tightly balanced, and 1 million barrels a day here or there could make a big difference. And maybe we're in that situation, but there's this longer term play that I think it's complicated. There's this question of the recession that many people think is coming. There's a question of how demand evolves in a world where we are continuing to electrify a fair amount. There's been lots of conversation over the last day and a half here about that. And so there are judgments in there too that have something to do with how oil prices play. So that actually leads me to a question that I wanted to ask, and then in a short time we're going to go to questions from the audience. So get your questions on the screen, and if it's in the font that's up there right now, there's not a chance that any of us are going to. So I'll make up something. But so in any case, the question I wanted to ask is whether Yeah, how all this plays with the many efforts to figure out how to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and that sort of thing. So part of it might involve the domestic versus international trade. You know, the sun shines on places and the wind blows at places. And so those are certainly resource elements that you can put to work. But as you say, Condi, there's a long transition period involved in that. So how do those fit together? And does what's going on at the moment change that in any material way, or is it the long term is the long term?
I think it simply makes it more evident to us that this is an important question, and probably some of the urgency around having answers to it. And I would cite a couple of things. One is in terms of the long transition. That's what the Door School is going to figure out. So come back in a couple years, and Arun and his faculty will have figured it out. But I strongly would urge everybody to put the question in a way that really makes us focus on where is supply going to come from. That's why I always say, is it that you want it to be from the Middle East, from Iran, where's it going to come from? And now, if you have an answer to where it's going to come from, that leads you to do certain things about, for instance, the North American platform. It doesn't mean, by the way, that you simply say, well, we're going to make the transition longer. You might even want to make the transition shorter. But if you're going to get investment in large-scale projects, you're going to have to convince people that they're going to pay off. And saying in 7 years you'll be out of business is just not going to work. And so that's when I said I think we have some irreconcilable questions that we'd like to have it both ways. You know, politicians are not good at doing this kind of thing because they hold contradictory thoughts in their heads all the time, but they never try to actually reconcile them. And the problem here is somebody's going to have to reconcile them if we're going to decide how hard are we going to push for development on the North American platform. What does it mean for infrastructure like pipelines? What are we going to say to the Mexicans who went to all the trouble of actually changing their constitution so they could have foreign investment in Pemex? What are we going to say to the Canadians who went through all the political trouble of agreeing to the Keystone, and then we, in one executive order, decided not to do it? You know, people always talk about treating allies well. Well, we didn't treat anybody very well around these issues. So I would say, ask yourself the question, where do you want to come from it, and what do you want it to come from, and what does that mean for the North American platform? And if you put it that simply, maybe politicians have to answer it in a more straightforward way.
Oh, come on, you worked in Washington.
There's always hope. I've been gone a long time. Maybe I forgot.
So you mentioned pipelines, among other things, and there is a question now that I can actually read that says, who blew up the Nord Stream pipeline?
I have my suspicions, but I have no inside information.
No, I don't think any of us do.
No,
but,
no.
So I'm not surprised that we dodged that one.
Yes.
So
just before we get to these questions,
yeah, sure.
I just think because I know what. Well, two things. I mean, the long term, there has to be a mix, and this dichotomizing of this debate, I just find irrational, and we need political leadership that gets out of it. And that's easy for me to say up here. It's hard, you know, if you're working in government or an elected official. But my Canadian friends would say, because I just had this conversation with them several months ago, because we're you know, there's a coalition of people working on sanctions, and they would just remind you that the North American platform that Condi keeps referring to, those are democratic countries, and we should remember that in this. If you want to get your energy from democratic places or autocratic countries, we got a couple nearby, and they would appreciate if we would remind ourselves of that from time to time. And that I think is an important thing to remember. The last thing I would say is this is just anecdotal, but crises creates opportunity. Anecdotally, in Europe, there's a conversation about how to speed this up and think more creatively than before, and I hope they leverage markets and innovation and technology, right? Not just government regulation, and I think that's the right mix. And in Ukraine, as you can imagine, this is not some abstract thing down the road. They're literally having to think, how do we get to next spring using what we call alternative forms of energy? And they're doing really creative things. Decentralized, it sounds kind of obvious, right? But it's not obvious to me. But decentralized sources of energy, suddenly for millions of Ukrainians, is their #1 priority right now, right? That's interesting. That kind of crisis does create these opportunities and market opportunities too, by the way.
Mike, you're absolutely right. But again, I just want to go back. It's not enough, all right?
No.
And
It's just
the problem
all
is,
together.
Yeah, but the problem is politicians will want to say, oh, we're going to do this thing where we do substitution and so forth, because they really don't want to deal with the hard question about what to do about the American, and I'll say, again, North America, because the Canadians and Mexico are part of it, because they don't want to answer that question. So they say, oh, we'll substitute and we'll go to... Not possible. Mm-hmm. The other point that I would make is we could so use an international kind of conversation or an international way of handling all of this. Leave aside the Russians and some of the bad actors. But I have to say that when we go to something like COP or whatever, we don't really get an answer to that first question of how are individual countries going to balance the 3 E's. They're at different levels of development. They're at different levels of technology. A couple of ideas that have come out that I think are worth considering. Arun was on, and Steve Chu and others, when George Shultz convened a task force at Hoover, and I think, Lynn, you were a part of that. They came up with the idea of maybe we really do need a carbon price at this point, right? But telling politicians that you need a carbon price with gasoline, it's probably not going to fly. Mm-hmm. Another idea that's been out there is, could you actually, with technologies that are responsive to the question of energy mix and clean technology alternatives, could you go tariff-free in the international system so that poorer countries might be able to afford them? There are all kinds of ideas out there, but it's going to take somebody who's willing to realize that this is a very important and yet difficult period, and there are going to have to be some hard choices, not easy ones.
Mm-hmm. So there are a couple of questions here. Well, there are multiple questions about China, and so maybe we should talk about that for a minute. How does we've already talked a little bit about China in the oil market and negotiating hard. Does it change China's view of the clean energy transition? Does it help or hurt the tensions between the U.S. and China now? From your various points of view, take a look at that.
Well, first of all, China and the clean energy transition. China is doing some things. They're still building coal-fired plants as well, because it's a big country and they need the energy. I am hoping that the one area that we might actually be able to reopen discussions with the Chinese, we've basically been shut off from each other for a whole variety of reasons, might be on issues of climate change and energy mix. There had been some thought that might be an area of cooperation. It would seem to me that given the fact that it's a social problem for China, that you still can't breathe the air in Beijing, that they have an incentive to want cooperation in this area. The other thing about China, though, of course, is that their internal politics is turning in a very difficult way toward more authoritarian, more Marxist-Leninist, less reformist, more state-owned enterprises, which are not known for either their environmental sensibilities or for their technological capabilities. Mm-hmm. Really kind of the goose that laid the golden egg, these wonderful tech companies like the Alibabas and the Tencents are being pushed back because any authoritarian worries about alternative sources of power, and people like Jack Ma were starting to be seen as alternative sources of power. And if you ever get what I call authoritarian envy, oh, they build such great airports, oh, they're so smart, oh, they're so strategic, just say 2 words to yourself: zero COVID, and realize how much authoritarians can make just really stupid decisions. By the way, there was a stupid decision a few decades ago called one-child policy, and now 34 million Chinese men don't have mates. So I think the Chinese, it's going to be very interesting, because right now the Chinese economic runway looks less favorable than I think most people would have thought, because of internal decisions that they're taking.
Yeah, and there's a parallel question from the audience too about sort of what the long-term structure and prospects for the economy in Russia might be. You talked about the isolation that has been imposed. Is that something that you think will have legs, or is that something that goes away if and when we get to some sort of resolution in Ukraine?
No, I don't think it goes away, and I think there's a parallel story that the Chinese should watch what's happening in Russia and beware of what Condi just described, and especially this turn you saw after the 20-party Congress, lots of concentration of power. All the technocrats, all the people that we wanted to get places on the Politburo, they all got pushed out. That's a story that story started earlier in Russia, about a decade ago, and now this move, again, highly irrational, ideological, I think is going to have really long-term negative consequences for the Russian economy. Everybody's looking, I hate to say it, because oil prices are so high, they're like, oh, the sanctions aren't hurting them, nothing's happening. I think that's a very short-term thing. And these are things that are hard to measure. I mean, as social scientists, they're hard things to measure over the long term. But what's going to happen there is they're going to be more isolated, so even more isolated than the Chinese, number one. Number two, it's the non-events that are the ones you need to remember. The non-investments, the non-students from Russia that don't come to Stanford anymore, that 20 years from now, that could have been the next 10 cent for Russia. That non-event, hard to trace and see, that's the stuff they're going to lose. The technological transfer that Condi was talking about. I've lost track, but I think over 1,100 companies have given up on Russia. You know what comes with that? That comes know-how, that comes innovation, that comes learning. It's not just simple tech transfer. It's like there's a whole ecosystem that is now breaking down. And then hundreds of thousands of Russians leaving. Russian's the third largest spoken language here in the Valley. And that's great for America. I want all the best and the brightest from all over the world. I want them to come from China too, by the way. We got to get that policy right. Yeah. But that's for me. But that is really bad for Russia. That they are losing those people. So you're not going to see that in 2 to 5 years, but it will have effects, over the long term. And I don't see it changing as long as Putin is in power. Some people think, well, we'll just, we'll fly Tony Blinken over there and we'll negotiate the peace process, and then we'll get back to, where we were. I just don't see that happening. A, because Putin's not interested, and B, I don't think a lot of Europe, because Europe is not one, but I don't think there's a lot of appetite for just going back to normal, given what he did in Ukraine.
Completely agree.
Yeah, so there are a variety of questions that sort of riff on this theme. One says that Europe will be short of energy not just this winter, but likely for several years. Prices will be high, and industry will suffer. How does that play with the relationship between the United States and Europe? Is Germany really in danger of losing its position as the economic powerhouse in Europe? So, do you see this playing into into that kind of stresses in Europe, or is this something that will be more survivable in the short term?
Well, I think there will be stresses. I don't doubt that there will be stresses. And as I said, there's stresses actually within Europe as to what the Germans are doing. But I wouldn't count either Europe out or certainly Germany out in this regard. I think they're moving quite quickly to try to find alternative supply. You know, there are gas fields out there in the world that have not been developed because people have had trouble getting investment. People have, because of, you know, how long are you going to be able to actually mine a field? And so it's not as if there isn't something that could be done, but you have to kind of start now if you don't want to see deleterious effects in 2, 3, 4, 5 years on some of these. And I think the Germans are pretty aggressively going at it. As Mike said, they're also looking at, you know, alternatives, and are there other ways to provide energy. The one thing they don't appear to be ready to look at again is nuclear. And that's a little bit of a surprise to me, because that could be done relatively quickly, because they only shut down their nuclear industry a couple of years ago. Well, they didn't really even completely shut it down. They began shutting it down. So the big problem, I think, in Germany right now is it comes down to political leadership. I think that we were all very impressed with Chancellor Scholz and his initial reaction to the Ukraine situation. Somebody said Vladimir Putin had managed to end German pacifism and Swedish neutrality all within a matter of months. And it's true, but now the realities are starting to set in. And German politics is nothing if not extremely difficult, given the coalition nature of their governments. And so can they move quickly enough on some of the alternatives that they have? It's a question, but I'm not actually worried about the long-term economic future of Germany.
So we're almost out of time, but I'll just ask each of you we've talked about a lot of tough times ahead here. Is there anything that gives you hope? You see some hopeful signs that we can take with us?
Oh, I'm a huge optimist because I read history and I study history. I'm writing a book about the Cold War and the interwar period. So if you think it's bad now, go read about these periods. Even the late 60s, early 70s.
Some of us are old enough to remember that.
So remember, I think, first of all, I'm a techno-optimist. I'm a market optimist. I'm from Montana. I'm just optimist in general. I believe that we can solve these kinds of problems, provided we can keep our own democracy functioning. That we don't have, the clock's at 20 seconds. We don't have time to tackle that. That's what worries me the most. That if we get that right, we have the ecosystem, we have the technology, the markets, and I'm talking about the free world here. I'm not just talking about the United States, but we'll be the driver of it. I was just at an energy conference 2 weeks ago, and everybody was complaining about all the horrific regulation in America, various different energy sectors, and I said, well, where's the best place to do business? And they all said, oh, America, of course. So, it's all compared to what? But historically, remember, like late 60s, early 70s, there was no great time here in the United States, right? Marxism, Leninism was riding all over the place. We had internal divisions here. That's when we had energy rationing.
Political assessment.
I was a student here in the 1969.
Well, so my students don't remember it. And so when they're pessimistic, I say, go talk to their parents and grandparents about and so just, we have the possibility as free democratic societies for renewal. There's no doubt about that. The evidence is clear. We just have to make sure we preserve the basic institutions that allow that to happen.
Yeah, I would
the last word.
Well, I would just briefly add, I'm also tremendously optimistic, and I'm optimistic on a couple of scores. One is, a colleague of ours, Steve Kotkin, has a line that I just love. He says, if you don't know history, everything is unprecedented. And so we're going through a bit of a point where everything's unprecedented. This is the first time. Actually, no, we've been through some pretty difficult times before. Secondly, I am kind of a techno-optimist in that, who would have thought that 25, 30 years ago that we would be using a little thing like this to do just about everything for us. So there's somebody out there that's going to invent something that's just going to blow us away. If we're smart about technology, I will say human beings are almost always better at the knowledge part than the wisdom part. So we have to be a little bit careful on what these technologies mean in the hands of particularly authoritarians, but also in our own hands. But I think technology, and we sit here in the kind of cradle of innovation, I'm a believer that it will help us. And then finally, I get to be a university professor, and I have to tell you that every day when I see our students, this is the most public-minded generation I've taught. And they do want to change the world. They're in a hurry, and we have to say sometimes, okay, you have to kind of know something before you can change the world. It's not as if people don't care, and it's not as if the next generation doesn't care. And so that makes me tremendously optimistic too.
Well said. Please join me in thanking our panel.
That's great.